Good evening and very warm welcome to the Oxford Martin School. Thank you for coming out on this particularly rainy evening. I think you all in for a treat. For those of you that have just started at Oxford and this is your first term, a particularly warm welcome. The Oxford Martin School is an interdisciplinary group which focuses on the big challenges of the future, and you'll find a very, very wide range of events going on here on the website. I was the founding director of the school. In 2006, I came to Oxford. Ian Golden, I'm now the Professor of Globalization, and one of the enormous pleasures I had was being able to put people together to create very exciting teams. And so I was absolutely delighted in 2012 to be able to recruit Carl Frey, fresh out of his doctorate in Berlin, to come and work on a team we put together on technology and employment, the intersection of technological and economic change, working with Michael Osborne, who was fresh out of his doctorate in the engineering department here. As you know, the rest is a short history, and they have done absolutely fantastic work. In 2013, very soon after Carl arrived here and started working with Michael, they produced a paper which really changed the way that people think about this area. It's a sign of its success that it has been a source of much controversy and contradiction because it really defined that space, and many other people have subsequently done work in that area. But Carl's remained at the head of it. I stepped down in 2016, and I'm delighted to see that Sir Charles Godfrey, the current director of the school, is in the back. He has to leave early, which is why he's not up here doing what I'm doing. Carl has gone on to win a number of grants after that. We've been very fortunate in this work program to benefit from funding from Citibank, and in fact they are just renewing that again. So we're absolutely delighted to be able to keep drilling down and pursuing this vital research agenda. Will we have jobs in the future? What will the jobs be? Where will they be? And what are the implications in terms of inequality, wages, and so on? The Technology Trap is a magnificent book. It's for sale afterwards at a massively discounted price of £15. If you go down the road, you'll have to buy it for 24. So buy it here, and there will also be a drinks reception to which all of you are invited at 6 o'clock. So I'm delighted to welcome Carl and for him to launch his new book, The Technology Trap, Capital, Labor, and Power in the Age of Automation.
Thank you, Ian. It's such a pleasure to be back here. To my favorite place, my favorite lecture hall in the world, not just because I only have to take the elevator one floor down in order to get here, but also because it's the place where everything actually started back in 2012 when Ian, Mike and I got together and began to discussing what the future of work might actually look like, how the division of labor is evolving as artificial intelligence is progressing. And as Ian mentioned, it's been a source of a bit of controversy. Hopefully we'll be able to add to a bit more to that controversy today. But the theme of the book is very much sort of trying to shed some light on the times we're living in through the lens of history. Because what we estimated back in 2012 is that roughly 47% of jobs are at high risk of being automated. And the question that we've gotten consistently since then is this time different somehow? Because we've been through periods of rapid technological progress in the past. And I found it quite extraordinary when researching this book how much technology has progressed over the past 2 centuries, but how little the debate surrounding its effects has actually progressed. We are now living through an era of automation anxiety again, very similar to what we saw in the 1960s, in the 1930s, in the 1830s, and so on. And it feels quite natural somehow that people shouldn't feel that enthusiastic about the tornado that is coming for the office. And I was actually quite struck to see that a majority of Americans, and this is from a recent Pew Research survey, a majority of Americans now think that there should be restrictions on the number of machines that businesses should be allowed to implement in order to increase productivity growth. And this is not that puzzling through the lens of recent automation debates, but it is quite puzzling if we look at the long-run trajectories of mechanization and growth. I studied economic history as an undergrad. One of the first slides you encounter when you study economic history is this one, right? It shows that economic growth was roughly stagnant for millennia, a very long time, and took off in extraordinary fashion around 1800. What happens around 1800 is not that technology for the first time arrives. So there was a lot of important inventions before then, like the barometer, the telescope, the horseshoe, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of important inventions happening. But for the very first time, technology translates into higher incomes for the wider population. And the reason for that must be the mechanized factory, which allowed us to produce more with fewer people. Before 1800, there were few machines that relieved workers of a lot of burdens in their daily jobs. And as a result of the steady flow of labor-saving technologies that have been adopted since then, we are now able to produce roughly 40 times more in Britain than we were at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. And people's income as a result of that is roughly 40 times higher, adjusted for inflation. Now, you might say that comparison doesn't make any sense, because the consumer basket at the dawn of the Industrial Revolution was very different than the consumer basket that you can buy with your incomes today. All of these things didn't even exist. Ordinary people at the time could only look at the lives of the wealthy in envy, who had servants to do the most tedious things for them. Today, most of us, or all of us here in this room, have access to the electric servant in terms of dishwashers, washing machines, vacuum cleaners, and so on, that relieves us of a lot of tedious work. Not to mention other inventions like the automobile and antibiotics. And if that wasn't enough evidence of progress, consider the fact that producing those goods and earning those higher incomes have become so much more comfortable as well. Not so long ago, a significant share of the population worked in coal mines. Cave-ins and explosions were part of everyday working life. Lung disease often part of the work package. Today, most of us work in air-conditioned offices. The worst thing that happened here at the Martin School in recent memory was when the coffee machine broke down. And I think that puts things in perspective. And if we only look at the sectoral changes in the composition of the workforce, that also understates the transformation that is taking place. So if you take the job of a farm laborer in 1900, that person would have walked the fields with nothing more than animal power. He would, or she would, be exposed to hazardous weather conditions, swarms of insects, all sorts of unpleasant things. Today, a farm laborer in the industrial West usually sits in his or her tractor and can listen to the music of his or her choice. So it's quite extraordinary what a leap forward that has happened over the past 200 years. The point of the book is that that leap forward is only half of the story. What did the people actually say when the mechanized factory arrived? Well, I think there is no doubt that the Industrial Revolution laid the foundations for modern growth and much of the increases in growth and well-being that has taken place. But the Industrial Revolution itself was polarizing. So, for example, Benjamin Disraeli, before he became Prime Minister of Britain, wrote a novel called Coningsby, in which one character remarks that I see cities peopled with machines. Certainly Manchester must be the most wonderful place of modern times. The very same year, Friedrich Engels published his Conditions of the Working Classes, which was written during a stay in precisely Manchester. And Engels had a very different take on what was happening. He argued that mechanization only serves to downgrade people, as it puts them in the repetitive motions of machinery, which can be deemed unnatural. And he also argued that it took over a lot of people's jobs, reduced their wages and incomes to subsistence, and led to the immiseration of the working class. Now, we know from history that he was wrong about the future, but he was actually fairly on target about the period he lived through, because what he witnessed was what economic historian Bob Allen has called Engels' pause, the 7 decades of the classical period of the Industrial Revolution, where the British economy first took off, but very little happened to the wages of ordinary people. Now, the wage data for this period of time isn't great, but if you look at supplementary sources like data on consumption or biological indicators such as height, they paint a similar picture. The cohorts born in 1750 were actually taller than the cohorts born in 1850, suggesting that people's nutrition was adversely impacted as well as their incomes diminished. And at the heart of the industrialization process was the replacement of middle-income workers. So artisan craftsmen who would do sort of every step in the production process themselves, often in their home, surrounded by their wives and children. Their incomes came under pressure as the mechanized factory arrived. And what the factory did is that it took advantage of cheaper labor, child labor in particular. And it's a really noted fact that the early spinning machines of the Industrial Revolution were specifically designed to be tended by children. Many factory owners realized that to sap resistance to mechanization, they were better off by trying to innovate in such ways as to get around that. And children often didn't have much bargaining power. They only got food and lodging, and they were easy to enforce the factory discipline upon. They were the robots of the Industrial Revolution, if you like. Now, a key question to economists and economic historians has been, why would people voluntarily have participated in the industrialization process if it reduced their utility? Well, the simple answer is that they didn't. They expressed their thoughts and feelings in verse, like the one you can see above. They petitioned to Parliament to block the introduction of machinery on several occasions, and they rioted against the mechanized factory. And all the Luddites achieved was getting the British government to deploy an even larger army against them. The army that Wellington took against Napoleon in the Peninsula War of 1808 was actually smaller than the army that was sent out against the Luddites. And I think it's important to remember that while much public commentary focused on the Luddite riots in particular, there was a long wave of machinery riots that swept across Britain and even Europe. And all of them didn't have to do with the appalling working conditions of the factory. You saw similar riots happening against agriculture machines as well. And I think that the economic historian Eric Hobsbawm summarized it nicely when he said that what began with the construction of the first factories and ended with the construction of the railroads also ended with the publication of the Communist Manifesto.